Good afternoon, and welcome to our continued reading of the split history of westward expansion. Today our focus will be looking at westward expansion from a different point of view. Every single story or fact has multiple points of view, meaning the eyes through which a story is told. Sometimes pieces of information are balanced, which means you see both sides. But other times, you can see the opinion of the author from the information they present to you in writing. If we remember our literacy work from the first few weeks of distance learning, we read articles about technology. Some of the articles were written from the point of view that technology is harmful, while others were written from the point of view that technology is helpful. Let's look at westward expansion. Can there be more than one side of the story? Whose side have we heard from so far? If you said the settlers, you are correct. The information that we gathered in the first 4 chapters of this read aloud were from the Europeans' point of view, moving west for better lives. But are there other groups? Today we'll be looking at westward expansion from the eyes of another group, the Native Americans, who were inhabiting the land long before the settlers knew of the New World's existence. Okay, so we're going to start with Chapter 1 from the American Indian perspective. And I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm going to read portions of this chapter that really specifically help us identify the Native American point of view about settlers moving west. I'm going to start down here at this 3rd paragraph. American Indians lived in North America for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. The Indian people lived in many separate tribal groups across the continent. Each of the more than 600 tribes had its own language, culture, and way of life. Some of the tribes stayed in one area. Others moved from place to place, following buffalo herds or changes in the weather. American Indian tribes shared a deep respect for nature. The majority of them believed that the land was something no one could own, not themselves or the settlers. They believed that land could be used for a while, but must be preserved to be passed on to the next generation. Most also believed people were only a small part of nature and had a moral and spiritual obligation to give back whatever they took. So when I pause to think about my reading, I see one thing that is different than what I read from a settler's point of view. The settlers moved west to better their lives. In one way, they could own their own land. But from the Native Americans' point of view, land was something that no one could own, not themselves or even the settlers. They believed that land could be used by all for a while, but all must be able to preserve it so that it could be passed on to the next generation. The Native Americans also believed that they belonged to nature, and they had an obligation to give back to that nature instead of taking it away, which is also different from the perspective of settlers who were mining gold in California, which meant taking precious minerals from the earth. Continuing on, new inhabitants. When European settlers came to North America, many of them in the 1600s, Indians were curious about the new people who had moved to their land. The American Indians helped the settlers by guiding them through the area and giving them assistance as they set up their farms, sharing what they knew about native plants and animals. The Indians also warned the newcomers about dangerous winter weather. In 1607, Chief Wahunsaka, known to the settlers as Chief Powhatan, supplied food to hungry settlers in the colony of Jamestown, in what is now Virginia. In 1621, a Patuxet Indian named Tisquantum, also called Squanto, helped the settlers of Plymouth Colony survive by teaching them native methods of fishing and farming. But as more and more settlers came to North America through the 1700s, the majority of American Indians grew increasingly unhappy. The settlers were moving onto land where American Indians already lived. The Indians didn't like seeing the land that they hunted, fished, and lived on being taken over. Their unhappiness sometimes led to attacks on the settlers. The Indians believed that if they fought the settlers would be frightened into leaving. So when I pause here to think about my reading, I compare it to what I've read about the settlers. The settlers were happy that they were able to find better lives, moving into an area where they can own their own land and start farming and creating businesses and becoming prosperous. But what I'm learning now is that through the eyes of another person, that land was being taken away from them without even being asked. So this is similar to like your neighbor coming into your house and taking over your video game controllers or eating food out of your refrigerator without asking. That would be kind of rude, and certainly not behavior that would be welcome. The settlers didn't go away. Instead, more immigrants moved to the United States every year. As the eastern United States became settled, the government wanted to expand its boundaries. But if the country was going to grow, it needed more land, so the government looked west. In 1803, the United States doubled in size with the purchase of vast tracts of land from France, called the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase gave the United States an additional 828,000 square miles of land. President Thomas Jefferson chose the exploration team of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to go into the new territory to survey the land. The explorers' reports on their journey into the Northwest encouraged more settlers to move west. These western lands weren't empty, however. American Indians had made them their homes for centuries. So again, I'm going to stop and pause and think about my reading. And here, I think, at the beginning, the Native Americans truly wanted to share the open area with these settlers who were moving in. Maybe they wanted their lives to be better too, with trade from the European settlers moving west. But however, I think their opinion changed as I see more settlers moving, and I look at that text where it says the western lands weren't empty. Somebody had been living in them. So if I look at it from the Native Americans' point of view, again, it's like somebody coming into my home and taking things away without my asking, or actually just building their own home on the same property that my home is already built. I could understand why the Native Americans would be angry and maybe attack the settlers. Moving on, broken treaties. In order to get the land in the West, the government began to negotiate with American Indians. Government leaders traded such things as guns, horses, and clothing with the Indians in exchange for the land. The Indians signed treaties that said they were giving their land to the United States. The treaties also said that the tribes would have to move off their land to reservations, land the government had chosen specifically for them. But reservations were usually on poor land where no one else wanted to live, and were almost always much smaller than the Indians had been told they would be. As the 1800s continued, more treaties were signed between the United States government and the U.S. and the American Indians. With every treaty, the American Indians lost additional land and were forced to relocate. As the settlers traveled west, the routes they took were the ones that best suited their needs. All too often, the treaties made with the Indians were ignored, and the settlers crushed grasses and scared away game. This upset the Indians, but since there was still plenty of land available, they chose not to fight. So again, if I stop and to pause and think about my reading, this is like trading something with your friend. You wouldn't trade something more valuable with something less valuable. So for instance, you wouldn't trade one of your video games that meant a lot to you for a pencil. And that's what was happening with the Native American tribes. Their land was being taken away, but they were given land that you couldn't farm on, or smaller pieces of land, or land that was near bad drinking water. So it was an unfair situation. I didn't learn about any of this when I was reading it from the settlers' point of view. I looked at their hardships, yes, but it always looked like they were getting the better end of the deal as they moved west. Some Indians were hopeful that they would be able to get along with settlers, but the majority of American Indians weren't as optimistic. They felt cheated by the United States government and angry over how they were treated. It seemed clear to the American Indians that westward expansion was going to mean a huge change in the way they lived their lives. It was also clear that there wasn't much that they could do about it. Fur trappers and American Indians. White fur trappers came to the West beginning in the 1640s. The trappers hunted and trapped animals for their furs, which they sold in the East. Trappers never stayed long in one place. They moved around the countryside, always on the lookout for good places to trap. The trappers were the first white settlers most American Indians had ever seen. As the trappers and Indians got to know each other, they got along well. Many American Indians helped trappers by showing them around the unfamiliar land and by acting as their guides. Fur trappers and the American Indians shared an annual event every summer near the borders of present-day Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. Called the Rendezvous, it was a combination of games, gambling, and storytelling that lasted for several days. So once again, I'm going to look over here, and it says, in this last paragraph, it seemed clear to the American Indians that westward expansion was going to mean a huge change in the way that they lived their lives. That's true for both groups, the settlers and the American Indians. The settlers, it was going to change their lives for the better. They were able to own their own land, farm, create businesses, and become more prosperous than they had been before in their other colonies or countries. However, the same couldn't be said for Native Americans, because that land was rightfully theirs. They lived on it before anybody else. Somebody else walked onto it and took it away from them and forced them to live somewhere else. If we put ourselves in the Native American shoes or look through the situation from their eyes, yes, it seems unfair. And it's similar to, like I said before, somebody moving into your home and telling you to leave. Just think about that while you're reading the rest of your information about westward expansion. So far, you've read about it from the settler's point of view. Maybe you should be looking through the Native American eyes as you continue to research about your topics and westward expansion.